7 nights now, Marge Vaughn hadn't slept past 2 hours running. She sat on an upturned bucket at the edge of a smoking dirt mound the size of a small barn, watching a thin blue thread of smoke rise off the top of it, and she did not take her eyes off that thread for longer than it took to blink. Behind her, down the slope, the valley's windows were dark, and decent people were in their beds. Marge Vaughn was on a bucket in the cold, watching smoke. Her neighbors had a word for it: foolishness. Ellis Price, who farmed the next hollow over, told his wife that the widow had finally gone the way her husband went, meaning strange, meaning not right in the head about that mound. Word like that travels a valley faster than the smoke does. She'd heard worse. She kept watching the smoke. What she was doing had a name, if anybody had bothered to ask her for it, instead of talking about her over a fence. She was burning charcoal the old way, stacking cordwood into a mound, covering it in leaves and dirt so it couldn't breathe, letting it smolder for the better part of 2 weeks under a blanket of earth she'd have to watch every hour of every day. The one thing that mound could not survive was being left alone. Everybody in that valley used to know how to do this. Now, almost nobody did. They bought their coal off a train, same as they bought everything else, and they'd decided somewhere along the way that a woman tending a smoking dirt pile was a relic of a harder, dumber time. Dorsey Yoder, who ran the only forge worth the name, laughed about it loudest of anyone. He'd gone over to coke years back, cleaner, hotter, shipped in by the ton, and he told anyone who'd listen that Marge Vaughn was burning good firewood into charcoal to save herself a few dollars a year and calling it a trade. Here's the thing nobody in that valley knew yet, watching her from their warm kitchens. By the end of that week, the same blacksmith who laughed loudest would walk 2 miles through snow to stand at the foot of her mound, hat in his hand, and ask her for what she had. Stay with this one to the end. What that fire ends up costing her is worth knowing before it happens. This is a story about a woman who wouldn't let a fire go out, and it starts with the reason she never could. Marge had come over from a valley in South Wales with a husband, 1 trunk, and a trade already old when her husband's father learned it. Rhys Vaughan's family had burned charcoal for 3 generations before it ever crossed an ocean. First for the ironmasters of Merthyr, then, once they'd landed in Pennsylvania hill country, for a furnace not so different from the ones they'd left behind. Charcoal iron was already going out of style by the time they arrived. Rhys didn't care. It was the one thing his hands knew how to do without thinking, and for a long while it fed a family well enough. Marge learned the trade the way you learn most things worth knowing, not by being taught, by being present while somebody else worked, and asking the right question at the right moment. Rhys built the mounds. His father, in his last years, sat by them and watched the smoke, because that was the part that couldn't be rushed and couldn't be handed to a stranger. Marge watched them both. Now you have to understand what watching the smoke actually means. A mound gives off different smoke at different stages, and reading it wrong costs you the whole burn. Thick white smoke, heavy and wet-looking, means the wood's still giving up its water, too early to touch anything. Thin, pale blue smoke means the water's gone and the wood's turning to nearly pure carbon underneath all that dirt. That's the moment you have to act, sealing the vents before the fire eats through what it just made. Miss it by an hour in either direction, and you either pull the fire too soon and waste half the wood, or you leave it too long and the whole mound catches and burns down to ash before morning. Rhys used to say his father could smell that shift before he could see it. Marge never quite managed that. She learned to see it instead, which was slower and harder on the eyes, and good enough. Rhys died at a mound in the winter of 1893. Not in a fire, not in a collapse. He'd banked the vents down tight on a bitter night, gone to check the low side of the mound where the ground dips, and stayed too long in the pocket where the air doesn't move. Carbon monoxide. No color, no smell, nothing you can see coming, He was found the next morning sitting against the earth wall like a man resting. The valley called it an accident, which it was, and a warning, which they mostly ignored. Marge never once let anybody forget how her husband died. Not to scare her children off it, because the mound could still kill you the exact same way, and pretending otherwise was its own kind of foolishness. She kept burning charcoal anyway. It was the trade she had, the one that could still put money and meal in the house, and there wasn't a version of quitting that fed anybody. That October, the almanac called for an ordinary winter. Marge didn't put much stock in almanacs. She put stock in the smoke. Building a charcoal mound properly takes most of a week before you ever light it, and every part of it is there for a reason nobody in the valley bothered to ask about anymore. You don't just pile logs and set a match to them. Marge stood cordwood on end in rings around a narrow central flue, a chimney of open space running straight down through the middle of the pile. That flue was how the fire got lit from the inside, and how she'd draw it later, when the burn needed feeding. Around that flue, the wood went up in tight, even rings, leaning slightly inward, packed close enough that a hand could barely fit between the pieces. Over the whole stack went a layer of leaves and straw, and over that, a foot or more of dirt, packed down hard with the flat of a spade until the mound looked less like a woodpile and more like a low, grassy hill. That earth coat was the entire trick. Wood burning in open air with plenty of oxygen just turns to ash. Wood smothered under dirt, starved of air, doesn't burn clean through. It cooks. The water goes first, then the tars and the sharp-smelling vapors, until what's left is close to pure carbon. That's charcoal. It's not a different kind of fire. It's the same fire, refused most of what it needs to finish the job. Around the base, Marge cut a ring of small vent holes, spaced evenly, no bigger than a fist. Too much air in through those vents, and the fire runs hot and eats the wood instead of cooking it. Too little, and the fire dies and leaves you with half-charred logs not worth the labor. She'd learned to read the smoke coming off each vent and open or plug them with wet clay, one at a time, coaxing the burn evenly around the whole mound instead of letting one side race ahead of the rest. Owen, 13 that winter, thought the whole business was beneath him most days, and said so. "Da's dead because of this," he told her once, not looking at her, stacking wood anyway because she'd asked him to. "And we're still doing it." Marge didn't stop working. "Your father's dead because he stood in the wrong place on a still night," she said. "Not because of the wood." She looked at him a second. "You stand in the right place, same as I taught you, it won't touch you." Owen wanted to work the coal breaker over in the next valley, where a boy his age could earn real wages sorting slate from coal and see the money the same week. Half the boys his age already had. Marge wouldn't hear of it, not yet, and the two of them had reached a kind of truce made mostly of silence. That was the thing nobody watching from the road understood. This wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. It was the only trade Marge had that she owned outright. No company store, no boss, no train schedule standing between her work and her family's supper. The mound had to be tended day and night for the better part of 2 weeks once it was lit. No going inside for the evening, no trusting it to burn itself out properly unwatched. A charcoal mound left alone for even a few hours could catch a draft through one weak spot in the earth coat, and once air got in properly, the whole pile could go up and burn itself to ash in a matter of hours. Days of wood and labor gone in an afternoon. That was the cost of the trade. Nobody paid her to sit up all night on a bucket. She did it because the alternative was losing everything the mound held. Emmett Rook had a commercial reason to want Marge Vaughn to fail, and he wasn't shy about it. He was the local agent for the coal company, the man who took the orders and arranged the deliveries off the branch line, and every bushel of charcoal Marge sold to a farmer or a small forge was a bushel of company coal that farmer didn't buy. He came by her fence one afternoon in November, ostensibly about a debt her late husband had left on the books, and stood there watching the mound smoke with an expression like he'd found something to be disappointed in. "You know the railroad brings coal in by the carload now, Mrs. Vaughn," he said. "Cheaper than what you're burning yourself half blind over. Man'd think you enjoyed the smoke." "Man'd think a lot of things," Marge said, and didn't look away from the vent she was watching. Rook smiled like he'd won something. "Just saying there's an easier way to live." Dorsey Yoder's objection ran deeper than money, because Yoder had once burned charcoal himself. He'd run his forge on it for years, the way his own father had, until the coke started coming up the branch line reliable and cheap, and he'd switched over the first winter he could afford to. Coke burned hotter with less fuss, needed no tending through the night, no smoke reading, no risk of gas. To Yoder, going back to charcoal wasn't old-fashioned. It was admitting he'd been wrong to leave it, and Dorsey Yoder was not a man built for admitting things. "Widows burning wood in the ground like it's still the old country," he said to the men loafing by his forge one cold afternoon, loud enough to carry. "I gave that up when I got the sense to." Now here's the part that cut closer to home than either of those men. The sharpest skeptic Marge had wasn't Rook or Yoder, it was her own son. Owen didn't say it was foolish. He said it was dangerous, and he wasn't wrong, and that made it harder to argue with. He'd grown up watching his mother sit vigil over the exact thing that had killed his father, and he couldn't understand why she'd choose to keep doing it when there was a mine 2 valleys over paying real wages to boys who could lift a shovel. "I could be earning by spring," he told her. "Real money. Not—" He gestured at the mound, not finishing the sentence. "Not this," Marge said for him. "No, not this." She kept her eyes on the smoke. "This is what we have, Owen. It's not what killed your father. What killed your father was one bad night. This is what feeds you." He didn't answer that. He picked up the spade and went back to packing dirt, the way he usually did when he'd run out of things to say and hadn't run out of being angry. That October, the first hard frost came early, 3 weeks ahead of what anyone expected, and it didn't lift. The cold that found that valley in the second week of February didn't announce itself the way a storm does. It just kept getting worse, day after day, until people stopped talking about when it would break and started talking about how they'd get through the next one. Later, papers as far off as Philadelphia would call it the worst Arctic outbreak anyone then living had seen. Cold that reached south to the Gulf Coast and left orange groves in Florida frozen on the branch. Nobody in that Pennsylvania hollow had a proper thermometer worth trusting, and even if they had, nobody was standing outside long enough to read one. What they had instead was the river. The creek that ran along the valley floor froze solid enough by the second week to carry a loaded wagon across without so much as a crack. That's not a small thing. That's a measurement, even if nobody wrote a number down. Then the branch line stopped running. The rails themselves weren't the problem so much as the cuts through the higher ground, where drifting snow filled in behind the plow crews faster than men could dig it back out. Somewhere around the 9th or 10th of February, the railroad gave up trying, and the valley was, for all practical purposes, cut off from anything that came in by train. Here's what that actually meant, in a valley that had already decided it didn't need the old ways anymore. Rook's coal yard had maybe 2 weeks of stock sitting in the bins, and no way to get more until the line reopened. Families started rationing lumps the way they'd once rationed flour. And Yoder's forge, which ran entirely on coke shipped up from the coal region, went cold within days of the last delivery. Coke, unlike charcoal, wasn't a thing a man could make himself in his own dooryard in a week. That mattered more than it sounds like it should. The valley's grist mill, the only place for miles that turned grain into flour anybody could bake with, had a cracked drive shaft that needed forge welding before it could turn again, a repair Yoder had been putting off since autumn, because there was always more coke coming next week. There wasn't going to be a next week now. Keep this in mind as the cold gets worse. By the time this is over, it won't just be her name people are watching. No mill meant no flour. No flour meant families were down to what they'd already ground and whatever they could boil whole. The talk on the road stopped being about the cold and started being about the mill and who could fix it and with what. Rook sold the last of his coal in the second week of the freeze, at whatever price the last customers in line would pay, and then he had nothing left to sell. He shut the coal yard, sat by his own stove burning the dust and slack out of the empty bins, and discovered what it felt like to be a man with nothing anyone needed. Dorsey Yoder discovered something worse. He had the forge, the anvil, the skill in his hands built over 20 years, and no fuel that could get iron anywhere near hot enough to weld. He tried scrap wood in the firepot out of pure stubbornness, working the bellows till his arms gave out, and got the shaft up to an orange glow and no further. Wood alone, however hard you blow on it, tops out well short of where iron needs to be to take a weld. It's not a matter of trying harder. The fire simply doesn't have anywhere higher to go. He put the tongs down and stood there a while, looking at a piece of iron that wasn't going to get any hotter no matter what he fed the fire. Out at the Vaughn place, the mound kept smoking, same as it had all along. Marge wasn't rationing anything. She'd banked 3 cords into that mound back in October, same as every year, and it didn't care what the railroad was or wasn't doing. What she was counting that week wasn't her own supply. It was how many chimneys in the valley had gone from steady smoke to thin. She knew what thin smoke from a stove meant. She'd been reading smoke her whole married life. There was a question sitting under all of it that nobody had put words to yet. If the mill couldn't be fixed, the valley went hungry before the cold even let up. And there was exactly one fire left standing in that hollow that still had anywhere higher to go. Owen decided, on his own, to prove something. He'd heard the talk about the mill same as everyone. He knew his mother had charcoal enough banked from the last 2 burns to matter, sitting bagged in the shed more than she needed for herself. Some part of him, 13 and proud and tired of being the boy whose father died at that exact mound, wanted to be the one who carried it down to Yoder's forge and came home having fixed something. He went out to the mound late, after his mother had finally gone in to warm her hands and check on Nesta, meaning to load a sledge with charcoal from the cooling side of the pile without waking anyone or asking anyone's permission. What Owen didn't know, because it's not the kind of thing you learn until somebody teaches it to you directly, and Marge hadn't yet, not fully, was that a mound gives off carbon monoxide long after the flames are out of sight, especially low along the ground on the downwind side, in the exact kind of still, windless cold that had settled over the valley that week. No smell, no smoke you could see rising to warn you, just air that quietly stops being air. He knelt down on the low side to pull bagged charcoal out from where it was stacked against the earth wall, in almost the same spot where his father had sat down and not gotten up 6 years before. Marge came back out to check the vents one more time before bed, the way she did every night whether anyone thought she needed to or not. She found her son on his knees in the snow, slow to answer her, slower to stand, saying the ground felt like it was tilting. She knew that sign. Reese's father had described it to her once, years before either death. The dizziness, the thickness in the chest, right before a man stops noticing anything's wrong at all. She got Owen up by the coat collar and half-dragged, half-walked him clear of the low ground and into open air, farther than felt necessary, until his breathing came back to something steadier and the color came back into his face. Neither of them said much for a while after that. There wasn't a speech in either of them. "I wanted to bring it down myself," Owen finally said, sitting in the snow, still shaking some. "To Yoder, for the mill." "I know what you wanted," Marge said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Next time you ask me first. Not because you're not able, because I'm the one who knows where the ground goes quiet." Word of it reached Dorsey Yoder by the next morning anyway, the way word does in a valley that size, that the widow's boy had gone down near that mound the same way her husband had, and lived only because his mother knew the one thing he didn't. Yoder walked the 2 miles out to the Vaughn place himself that afternoon, hat in hand, the mill shaft still cold and useless in his shop. He didn't apologize, not in so many words. Dorsey Yoder wasn't built for that. What he said, standing at the edge of her dooryard, was, "I need heat that Coke would have given me, and Coke isn't coming. Whatever you've got banked, I'll pay for. And I'll want to know how you built that mound, because I gave up something I shouldn't have." Marge looked at him a long moment. "You gave up something that was never wrong to begin with," she said. "You just forgot it worked." She sold him charcoal enough to weld the shaft, and more besides, and didn't charge him extra for the 2 miles he'd walked to ask. So here is why a woman with a dirt mound had heat a whole valley's iron trade couldn't manage without her. It comes down to 2 plain facts, and neither one is a trick. The first is what fire does when you starve it of air. Wood burning freely in open air just turns to ash. Most of its usable energy goes into boiling off water and throwing light and heat straight up into the sky, wasted. Seal that same wood under a foot of packed earth, and it can't burn like that anymore. It cooks instead, slow and starved, driving off water first, then tars and sharp vapors, until what's left is close to pure carbon. Out of every 100 pounds of good cordwood Marge put into a mound, she'd bring out somewhere near 15 to 20 pounds of charcoal at the end of it. Call it about a fifth. The rest went off as smoke and steam. That fifth, though, was worth more than the other 4/5 combined, because it burned differently. The ladder of heat. Dry wood carries something like 15 to 18 units of heat energy per pound. Charcoal, pound for pound, carries close to double that. And an open wood fire, however you build it, tends to top out somewhere in the range of 900 to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to cook supper, nowhere near hot enough to weld iron. Charcoal, fed air through a bellows, climbs past that ceiling entirely, up into the range where iron itself starts to glow soft and workable, 1800 degrees and beyond. Wrought iron and mild steel need something close to that top end, over 2000 degrees, before 2 pieces will fuse into one under a hammer. Wood, no matter how you stack it or how hard you blow on it, simply cannot get there. It's not a matter of patience. There's a ceiling, and wood hits it long before iron is ready to weld. The second fact is weight, and it mattered more that week than any winter before it. Charcoal carries the same heat as wood at roughly half the weight, because it's already given up the water wood still carries. When a train stops running and every pound has to move by sledge or on a man's back, that difference is the difference between a fuel you can move and one you can't. It cost her something, though, and that part doesn't belong in the tidy version. The charcoal Marge sold Yoder that week was banked from a burn meant to see her own family through the rest of the winter. She sold off more of it than she meant to, because a valley without flour was a bigger problem than her own woodshed, and there wasn't a version of refusing that she could live with afterward. She never mentioned that shortfall to anyone. Owen noticed it in March, when the meals got thinner before the thaw properly set in, and understood without being told exactly where that charcoal had gone. People in that valley argued for years about how bad that February really was. Not whether it was bad, how bad exactly, compared to what came after. Nobody out at the Vaughn place owned an instrument that could have settled the argument. The nearest weather station worth trusting was the better part of a day's ride off, keeping its own record of a different hollow entirely. So there's no number here that means what a number ought to mean. What there is instead is what got written down after, by people who weren't standing in it. Newspapers as far south as Florida reported frozen orange groves. Farther west, a town in Montana woke to 60 degrees below zero on the 11th. The Mississippi River itself froze solid enough in places to walk across. What the thermometer actually read in Marge Vaughn's own hollow on the worst night of it, nobody wrote down. What's recorded, in the only way that mattered to the people living through it, is that the branch line stopped running for the better part of a week, and didn't move again until the freeze broke. That's the measurement they left behind. Not a number, a silence where the train whistle should have been. By the time that silence lifted, the talk in the valley had stopped being about the cold at all. It had turned entirely to who still had a fire that could do something the rest of them couldn't. The trains started running again in the last week of February. People walked down to the depot to watch the first one come through, the way you'd go look at something you'd half stopped believing existed. It brought coal and coke and the ordinary rhythm of the valley riding in behind it. But a valley that size doesn't forget a week like that one quickly, and it didn't pretend to. Dorsey Yoder kept a mound of his own going by the following winter, small, mostly for jobs that needed a heat coke couldn't reliably give him in a pinch. He never made a show of it. He just did it, the way a man does something he's decided he was wrong to have stopped. Emmett Rook kept selling coal. The valley still needed it, and Marge never claimed otherwise. But the easy scorn went out of how he talked about her mound. He stopped by that fence again in the spring, and what he said was closer to a trade than an apology. "Company can't get here every winter," he admitted. "Reckon there's room for both." Owen didn't go to the coal breaker that spring, or the spring after. He stayed and learned to read the smoke properly, the slow way, the way his mother had. Not because she made him, but because he'd knelt in the snow once and understood exactly what it was he'd been arguing with all along. By the next winter, 2 other families in the hollow had mounds of their own smoking on their back acreage, small ones, more insurance than trade. Nobody had a formal name for the practice at first. By the year after, people around there had started calling any such mound a Vaughan pile, without much thought to where the name had come from, the way names like that settle into a place and just stay. The principle underneath all of it never went anywhere either. Wood starved of air instead of burned in the open is still exactly how the world makes activated charcoal today, filtering water and scrubbing gas out of the air in places that would surprise you. Farmers now dig much the same idea into their own fields under a newer name, biochar, to hold water and feed soil for years past a single season. Marge Vaughan wasn't sitting on a lost art. She was sitting on the same chemistry, just older clothes on it. Years later, long after the mill shaft Yoder welded had been replaced twice over by newer iron, people in that valley could still point to the low, grass-covered mound on the Vaughan place and tell you, more or less accurately, what it had been for. Marge Vaughan never did stop watching smoke at night. She just had less reason, most winters, to sit up alone doing it. 4 years after that February, and 100 miles south, another family would face a different kind of hidden killer, one that came not from a fire, but from the very corn they ate all winter, prepared the way everyone around them prepared it. Nobody in that next valley would understand at first why it was only one household whose children stayed well. But that's a story for another night.